barriers and combating stigma attached to mental health and using sports to do so. So this session, we're going to talk a bit about marriage and divorce, the changes in English law, and the impact that may also have in Islamic Sharia law and the way that we live as an Islamic community. So firstly, I'd like to speak to Kareema about the increase of marital age. So in February 2023, the increase of marital age went from 16 or 17 with parental consent to the age of 18. Kareema, tell us why that happened, and is it a good idea?
I think it's a huge leap forward in tackling this usually hidden abuse, because child marriages are often associated with a lot of negative things, such as like domestic abuse, leaving education early, and limited career opportunities, not to talk of the range of physical and mental abuse these children suffer as a result of forced marriage or being forced to be in a marriage younger than they should be. I've got a couple of statistics from the Office of National Statistics.
Yeah.
So in 2019, of 219,000 marriages that were registered in the UK, 1,146 involved women under the age of 20. And statistics from the Forced Marriage Unit recorded 759 marriages. Of that figure, was 750 was solely forced marriages involving children below the age of 18, which I think is interesting. So this act coming into force definitely protects children, particularly girls, from being forced into marriage and the negative things that's associated with it.
Thanks, Kareema. So I know that there are several different indicators why this law needs to come into place, but there's also an issue around young girls giving birth quite early as well. It actually causes quite a lot of physical trauma. Yeah, indeed. And issues going on later in life as well. So it has a long-term impact on their physical well-being as well as their mental health well-being.
Do you think this is like partly education as well? Because obviously a cultural thing, a lot of people get married a lot younger and then they come into this country and they think it's okay because it's always happened. But now we're starting to understand more the impacts of it.
Exactly. And we definitely are. And I think it is, as you said, it's about education and educating the wider society as well, to sometimes what we do with our traditions aren't actually do have negative consequences for us in the long term. And what the Carmen Nirvana have also found out, they're another sort of charity, and they look a lot around honor-based violence as well. And they've actually found out that in 2017 there was at least 400 calls to the child helpline around honor-based violence, and this was actually also linked to underage marriages as well.
But this just shows, because a lot of people might turn around and say, well, Islam says it's fine, you can marry at a certain age. Once you've hit puberty, it's absolutely fine. But the thing is, it's one thing, it's a different time, it's a different generation we're living in. And as well as it's about educating, it's not sort of merging the culture and the religious side of things as well. And also understanding, listening to your children, listening to those people who are getting married. And it's about that, because sometimes we take the rights of those people and force them into these marriages, and that's when it usually causes problems.
Exactly. And I think,
because a lot of the marriages are, solely based on parental gain and then social, status, as opposed to actually getting married for love or
what's in the best interest of the child.
And that's what people forget. Islam also says about the whole thing about being in love. You have to have that attraction. You have to be able to give consent. Your child should be able to give consent before they get married.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people forget that part.
Yeah. And the way that English law is structured is that a parent can give consent to a child under the age of 18, so a 16, 17-year-old, before the law was changed. A parent could give that consent, but Islamically, that child should have been able to give consent as well.
Absolutely.
So when a child is trying to please their parents or being overridden by their parent, then that causes quite a few problems, and that could potentially even void the marriage before the law changed.
Because though it's the physical trauma that we're talking about, it's also the mental trauma, because if you're forced into something, that can actually affect you physically as well, because you're resisting certain things. So it affects loads of different parts.
Yeah, it does. And there's been a lot of scientific work around the way that trauma actually affects the body And there was a book out that says The Body Keeps a Score, and it talks about the fact that trauma affects your central nervous system, increases the risks of chronic diseases such as cancers and things like that, as well as other sort of immune suppressant sort of diseases as well. So we need to look at ourselves as whole people, and not distinguish between mental health, physical health, or the way that we present ourselves in the world.
Ironically, it's anti-Islamic, because if you're forcing your child to do something, you're not getting permission, however much you think you're being religious, but you're not, because you're not actually giving the person rights. And Islam came up with human rights before most people.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very thorough. I remember I'm a revert to Islam, and I reverted some 20-something years ago. And I was a law student around about the time that I reverted. And I realised actually, when I was reading sort of Bakare, the amount of different things in that actually probably influence partly English law as well, because it talks about consent, it talks about rights, it talks about contractual law, and all sorts of things on how that we should actually live our lives. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's spot on if you actually understand it. And this is why once you understand what you're praying and what it's about, all the answers are actually there.
Yeah, indeed. Kareema, have you got any more thoughts about
I think what you said brings us to the next question, really, in terms of how Islamically there's certain laws that have already been in place that would now just adopt in English law. So
yeah, and I think you're referring to the Divorce, Dissolution, Separation Act of 2020. But before we jump that, I'm not sure if you've got the information, Kareema, but I just thought we should let people know that if you are facilitating a marriage for a child under the age of 18, did you look into that? Did you want to talk about it? Or I can do it for you.
Yeah, you can do.
But if you're facilitating the marriage of a child under the age of 18, it's actually now a criminal offence. And that means you cannot even take a child out of the country to a country which would actually recognise that marriage and facilitate that marriage. You would be committing a criminal offence.
What's the maximum?
I'm not sure, actually.
You could be imprisoned.
You can be imprisoned. It's definitely imprisoning act. And also, you need to consider whether you want social services getting involved in the family as well. Because if you are trying to facilitate that, there's obviously there are safeguarding protocols that kick into place. So you could end up with children's services at your door, talking about removing your children, and actually looking at your wider family at that point, not just the one child.
Because that's it. They don't just investigate you; they investigate everyone and into their lives and their children as well. So you're affecting the wider family structure.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah, I think it's also important to let people be aware, because if they don't know what they're doing is wrong, not everyone is very conversant with the law. If they don't know what they're doing is wrong, then how do we?
Yeah.
This is it, and this is what my thing is, because this may be me just being very stereotypical, but what you find sometimes is the law is in English because we're in this country, and a lot of these things may happen in cultures where English is not their first language. Indeed. So they don't always understand. So sometimes it's not for us to educate them, it's for the local community or the institutions to actually turn around and say, you can't do this. Yeah. And even for those people who are doing the nikah or the ceremony to actually say, no, unfortunately, this is not right.
Exactly.
And to report it as well.
Yeah. And you're spot on there, because people may actually believe it's only a thing for being married according to English law, but it actually involves all traditional ceremonies as well. So you cannot enter into a nikah if you're under the age of 18 in this country.
Exactly. And the rule does say in Islam that you live by the law of the land.
Indeed.
Therefore, live it.
Indeed. Thank you. So, as Kareema suggested, there has been a change in divorce law. It came into being last April. We colloquially call it no-fault divorce. It was brought in by the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act of 2020. And it's like English law just caught up with Islamic law in that respect. Kareema, do you want to talk a bit about?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting piece of legislation that's come into force, because we're now seeing an increase in divorce applications, because the need to point fingers and play the blame game has effectively been removed. So more people are willing to come forward because they don't have to air out the dirty laundry, and they don't have to go through, especially divorces that are born out of domestic abuse situation. They don't have to relive that experience in court anymore. So
being re-traumatized.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's less contentious for the children. They don't have to be, subject to nasty divorces, because it does get nasty. So.
Yeah, and in the work that we do, we see that quite a bit, where children become a tool of divorce, and people sort of use the children in the sense of, can they hold on to more of the assets if they're holding on to the children?
People sometimes do it in a daily life. In marriage, you see it and you hear about it, and I can imagine the divorce, it's like 10 times worse, because they have to actually experience it.
Yeah.
And we've actually got interesting statistics, because in comparison to 2 years ago, April 2021, there's been an increase of 12,000 new divorces since a no-fault divorce came into force, which means people more willing to come forward if the divorce is amicable and they don't have to point fingers in court.
Excuse me. Yeah, exactly. And we're seeing at least 10,000 sole applications. So with the new law, you can actually have a joint application if you're actually agreeable to the divorce. You share the court fee, you progress it together, and it can be done quite amicably, quite nicely.
And what's ironic is, once again, Islam says that where there are times where you just don't want to be married anymore because of just neutral reasons, and you just have grown apart. And it does happen. It doesn't have to be one person's fault.
Indeed. And then and we look at the Sahabas. The Sahabas saw marriage as a union of soulmates. And if things didn't work out, they were happy to move on peacefully. They released each other from the marriage. There was no animosity and big issues. And some of the brothers were married more than 4 times.
Exactly.
And because that's how they saw marriage. Marriage is about working together. It's about unionship. It's about growing together. And if you can't do that with individual, then you release them out of peace.
And once again, looking at the English law, how there was such a big stigma attached to divorce, and how in the church they said you shouldn't get divorced, you can't get divorced. Whereas Islam from the start said, no, it can happen. Sometimes it does happen. And they put the rules in there for a reason.
Yeah, indeed. And, obviously English law has been strongly governed by the morals and rulings from the Church of England and Christianity. But strangely enough, there are churches that once you're divorced, they will not allow you to be marrying those churches.
Absolutely.
But we know that marriage can be a union and a base of society. If you're in a good, strong marriage and you raise your children within that sort of remit, then they become very productive within society. So then why would you not continue to promote marriage?
Yeah. And once again, it's that cultural thing as well, to educate your children, saying it's absolutely fine. If it happens, you come and talk about it. Whereas I know a lot of strong cultures are big, like, when it comes to divorce, you don't divorce. It should be a last resort. But sometimes you should be able to sit down with elders and say, it's not working out.
Yeah, I think it's setting a good example for the children. You don't have to stay in relationship just because you fear you'd be ashamed if you go through the divorce route. Is encouraging people to speak up and leave situations that not quite in their best interest.
But at the same time, obviously, you have to try to get mediation, work at it as much as possible, instead of being flippant and just get a divorce.
Yeah. So. And that's something that we've sort of discussed before, whether the no-fault divorce actually reduces accountability in a marriage. So it gets used very easily that, well, I can just fill out a paper and pay a court fee.
This is the other thing, because I don't know if it's a good thing as well.
Yeah.
So, because I think divorce rate's already going up quite significantly, and whether this is like an easy route just to get out.
Yeah. So then maybe that's the ill of society then, as opposed to the institution of marriage. And, we've been moving towards individualism for the past 40 odd years. And I think, it's not got any easier for our younger people as well.
No,
I mean, there's been a phenomenon around for some time in the English circles where they say you get married in your 20s, which is like your starter marriage, just to try and,
just to fit
it out and see if you grow in it, see what it's like. And then you get remarried in your 30s. Yeah. You get remarried in your 30s and you know what marriage is about. And that becomes your sticking marriage.
It's a long-term commitment, and it's about working at marriage and actually understand. The biggest issue I've noticed when it comes to marriage and when it comes to law is the pre-marriage. So people are all caught up in it, really excited, wants to do the wedding. They don't think about the law side of things or the legal side of things, and that goes on to what we were discussing earlier about the nikah ceremony and civil ceremony and all of that.
Yeah. So both nikah and civil ceremony are both contracts, but contracts with different weighting in this country. So, under the nikah is a contract between you, your spouse, and God, and it's governed by Quranic teachings and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. But under English law, it's an actual physical contract, which you have to go to court to break. It's not so easy to get out of it. And previously, before the law change, you had to find reasons of fault, or you had to wait a very long time with consent, or even longer period of time, or and prove that you've been abandoned. So it was very, very difficult to get out of those marriages. And there was a really famous case of Owens and Owens, where this lady had said, she had lived a life where she was absolutely miserable. Her husband wasn't a very good partner. We would probably say low-level abuse, and really quite difficult for her, but it wasn't enough to say it was definitely domestic abuse and didn't trigger those parts of the law. And the judges, unfortunately, because of the way the law was structured at the time, found that it wasn't enough to get divorced under. So she ended up remaining married to him until she was separated for 5 years. But this went all the way up to Supreme Court, so it was a very good test case, but she would have spent a lot of money getting it there to try to get out of this marriage. So we're quite thankful for no-fault divorce to come around, because people like her would be able to say, my partner isn't a very good partner and is not willing to be a very good partner, and I deserve better.
This is it.
No, but I think the longer waiting period also gives them time to reflect as well. So even if they do rush into the divorce process, I mean, the longer waiting time, you still have time to sit down and think if this is really what you want to do. So I think that's quite important as well.
Indeed. So it's a 26-week reflection period. With almost half a year to sort of think.
That mirrors the Islamic side of things, where it says once you've decided to go for a divorce, give it that waiting period. Yeah. And then after that sort of few months, if you still want to do it, then fair enough. Because sometimes people just need a breather or a break. I'm sorry.
We want a break.
We all want a break. Because life is very different now. We're all busy, we're all working, and things can get the better of you. And you argue, but that shouldn't be an automatic call for divorce.
Yeah. And it is a bit concerning that people might use it as flippant as we've known some young men to use the talaq.
Yes.
And throw it out there without real thoughts.
No, definitely.
Okay. So the other thing that we were discussing was whether a wife should be expected to pay into the marriage, or use her wealth in the relationship, even if she's earning more than the husband.
That's an interesting one.
You want to go?
You're the legal experts. I'll let you guys carry on.
Islamically, she's got no financial obligation to help if she doesn't want to. I mean, to be fair, he's supposed to take care of the financial side of things of the marriage. But we see a different side in English law, whereas she's seen as sort of selfish if she earns more and she's not helping out with major household expenses, or they kind of balance out your financial earnings to determine who pays more in child support situations, which I don't think obviously Islam promotes. So,
but it's a union between the two of you. At the end of the day, if you sit there, if you come into a marriage with this is mine and that is yours, then it's not going to work from the offset. I just believe that you're together, and it's best to work together. Obviously, the woman doesn't have to contribute. The man should provide in accordance to the rules, but it's an understanding.
No, I think the thing is feeling entitled. So you think because she's earning more, she has to contribute. I think that's what the conversation is.
No, that's it.
That is true. And what we've seen in practice is when we're looking at divorce, so divorce is governed by the Matrimonial Causes Act, and it looks at several things about the marriage. So it looks at the contribution from parties, what was built up in the marriage. So if one of you sacrificed to stay at home and the other person went out and built a business, but that person staying at home allowed that person to build the business during the course of the marriage. It looks at things like that. It looks at the needs of the couple. So are they going to be rehoused? Are there any children to be rehoused? Is there any debt in the marriage? It looks at lifestyle as well. So if you've lived quite a good life during the course of marriage, where you've had 3+ holidays a year, and the rental house and whatever else, and the business, etc., it looks at all of those sort of things as well. But on divorce, what we found a lot of people saying was, well, she didn't contribute to anything, and therefore why should she be able to take anything from the matrimonial pot? The way English law is structured is that you start from a principle of sharing. the fact that you've entered the marriage is a contract that you are going to.
This is what we were saying in the beginning. It's about
exactly two people, and how you decide to live that life. So, for example, if there's an agreement that she would stay at home and build, look after the children, run the house nicely, arrange social events and things like that, and he would go out and do all the work and be the breadwinner, then on divorce, it's only right that should be reflected upon. So
what happens in the case, as I mentioned earlier, if someone decided not to get a civil ceremony and did a nikah and they think they are married, do they still get the same rights?
No, they don't, unfortunately. It actually falls under a different part of law altogether, so they're completely out of the Matrimonial Causes Act. The Matrimonial Causes Act comes from a principle of sharing. Everything is shared 50-50 unless there's reason to deviate from that sharing principle. If you're not married under state law, so you haven't done a civil registry, or you haven't married in one of the very few mosques that are recognised and licensed to allow a legal marriage to be registered, then you are only married under nikah, and your only protection is in Sharia law. And in this country, you cannot enforce Sharia law.
Exactly.
So I have seen and I've had cases where ladies have been living with, and that's what we term it as, because it's cohabiting. It's not legal marriage, so we call it cohabiting. So they've been living with their partners for decades, and they say, well, we've contributed to the house, but their contribution might have been, I've paid some bills, I've done some food shopping, but they haven't contributed to the actual purchase of the house. So they've never put down a deposit, they've never paid the mortgage, they've never paid for home improvements such as renovations, extensions and things like that, and things that actually increase the equity of the house. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult for them to make any claims in English law. The act that they might fall under is called TOLATA, abbreviated. It's the Trust of Lands and Appointments of Trustees Act. But you have to be able to show your contribution to do that. So your contribution is not, I bought food for the house and I paid bills. It is, I paid a deposit, I paid the mortgage, I paid for the renovations, or I contributed to all of those three things, and I've increased the equity in the house by doing so.
And realistically, people, once you're married, because you're still in that sort of state, you don't really think about these things. So this is why the civil ceremony is worth actually going ahead and actually making sure that gets done. Yeah, really, because then that protects you long term.
It does, because if a relationship ends after, say, 19 years, and you have nothing to show for it.
Exactly.
But the little income that you've probably had during that time, whereas he stays in the house. And I say he because, on balance and statistics, it's usually the man has the assets and the woman lives with the man. So he remains in his house, he's got his house, he's safe, and she's technically homeless.
Exactly, and then to prove that you can have a stable home for your kids and income coming in, you have to prove all of that to be able to say that I can manage these kids without it being a safeguarding issue.
Indeed. Now, if there are children involved and the children's still under the age of 16, then she may have a little leeway, and it might be that he pays a lump sum to her so that she can rehouse the children, or he may give up the house for a period of time while the children are under age of 16, or if they go into university or something like that, up into their first degree. But then at that point, she then has to leave and fend for herself, and he will have his house back.
I think we should talk about prenuptial
agreements.
Yeah,
that's an interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting
controversial one as well. To say the least.
But it's controversial both in English law and in Islamic law. So prenups are they're not legally binding on the family law court. So you can enter in agreements as to how you think things should happen if the marriage doesn't work out and you divorce. So, for example, if you've gone into this relationship and you've already got property and a business and potentially inheritance, you can tie all those up in a prenuptial agreement to say that on divorce, none of those things are to be considered as matrimonial assets, even if you've done something like so. So if you have a trust, for example, or if you have property, if you've taken the income from them and used that for living within the marriage, then that can bring things into the matrimonial part. Right. But if you've kept it completely separate, then it's fine and it stays as
a separate entity.
A separate entity completely. But having a prenup, again, is another contractual agreement which kind of says we recognise that that asset will never be part of the matrimonial pot. But there are things that you have to consider in getting a prenup. So it has to be done timely before the marriage. So don't rush a prenup, or else it could be deemed as being something as a rush job and not being properly considered.
Slightly forced.
Slightly forced. You have to make sure that both parties have had independent legal advice, and you have to make sure that certain things have been considered. So if you've had a prenup and you haven't considered children, and you happen to have children, well, having children could actually void the prenuptial agreement. And it can make it very difficult to enforce that in court. So if you've considered all of those things, and you've been very clear about what will be matrimonial assets, what will not be matrimonial assets, and what happens if there's children, because the children are always paramount, and the family court's always going to want to make sure that they're taken care of first and foremost, because it needs to meet their needs. It's a safeguarding issue. Yep. So as long as all that's in place, if on divorce, and when you try to sort out the matrimonial assets, you can then put this prenuptial agreement before the court and said everything has been considered, the children's needs are met, and this is fair on the basis of everybody's had the correct legal advice as well. Then at that point, then the court might say yes, and they might ratify the prenuptial agreement and make a final financial remedy order on the basis of the prenup.
Okay.
What do you think the Islamic ruling on prenuptial agreement is?
I have no idea.
So I don't know if it's allowed in Islam. I'm not quite sure.
It'd be an interesting one, because obviously you come into a marriage and you say you are equal partners and you want to share everything. If you come in saying, well, this is mine, you can't touch this, it's that initial mindset. So though I don't know the ruling, I can imagine it sounds slightly selfish in a weird way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do know that on Islamic divorce, if he's asked for the divorce, then she gets to keep her dowry. So I suppose it's about making sure what you go into the marriage with is correct. So some people might say, oh, I'm just going to do the sunnah, and whatever's in my pocket, I give you as my dowry. Yeah. But if she's smart...
she'll say, this is my dowry.
Yeah, this is
mine.
Yes, exactly. So she might ask for something that's going to increase in value over time, which she can rely on divorce, or she might ask for a property, depending on what his means are, or something else, so that on divorce, she knows that she can set up a home and meet her basic needs from the beginning, and then build herself back up again.
Absolutely.
Do you think there's a question about trust if someone's requesting a prenuptial agreement? So, you're entering into a marriage and you're supposed to be in love, and then, you trust this person fully, because obviously you're entering a lifelong commitment. So to then bring up the conversation about a prenuptial agreement,
but then you could become paranoid as well, where you're thinking, why is the husband saying no? So it kind of goes two ways as well.
But then that goes to having communication within marriage anyway. So if you can't talk about the difficult things at the beginning when things are nice and lovey-dovey,
but this is just
when are you going to be able to speak about those things?
I've had conversations with people recently who have said, my husband before marriage goes, we'll talk about that after we're married. Everything's after we're married. It's like, no, these are really serious, important questions. And if you're mature enough to sit down and have that conversation, you know that this marriage is to last and it's long term. It's not just airy-fairy. It's not just for the big wedding day. It's actually for life. Yeah. And I think society's got a lot to answer for around what people expect within marriages as well. We still have all those Disney fairy tale princess stories and the knight in shining armor and things like that. And all my needs will be fulfilled once I meet the right guy. We all watched those movies. We all saw them. And everyone's expecting the pretty white dress, everything else, or whatever color you go for. But at the same time, it's the realization. It eventually kicks in.
Mm. Do you think prenuptial agreement should be legally enforceable? Because I get that the court does consider the intentions of the parties in making a decision ultimately, but do you think it should be legally enforceable because it respects the opinion of the two people who've entered into the contract?
I quite like the way the law's structured now, because I think the family court needs to be flexible, because there are life events that changes things, and we can never be too sure, what the course of the marriage is going to bring. And sometimes when you put contracts in place from the beginning and you'll say we're going to enforce it to the letter as opposed to the spirit of the contract, I think that can actually cause disequity. So the fact that the court can make sure that you've been well advised in the beginning, you've thought about some of the issues that might come up in life, and you've been quite clear about what is in the pot, what's not in the pot, but then they still have discretion on top. I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting.
And I guess it's honesty as well. It depends on how much people reveal up front. Because what you find so many times where later on people realize actually he or she's got this property, they've got this, or their parents have gifted them with certain things. It also comes, it's all about transparency and honesty. And I just think make sure you come into your marriage with your eyes wide open.
Yeah, indeed. So I suppose that the slightly more controversial question is about arranged marriages and whether they are something that we should still promote in the society that we live in. What are your thoughts?
I'm going to look over to Kareema first.
Personally, I think it still goes hand in hand with the first question about forced marriages. It's okay to arrange an arranged marriage, but if one party is not willing to enter into a marriage with the person you've arranged, I think that decision should be respected as opposed to you forcing it on someone. And then I think the arranged marriage culture is slightly outdated. I think people should be able to make decisions as to who they want to get married to, as opposed to you picking someone based on.
No, because do you know what? I know a lot of girls and boys out there who are struggling at the moment to find spouses. They're going online, which is absolutely fine with all.
That's the exception, though. That's the exception.
I don't know if it's exception. It depends on the culture and the communities. Because in our community, people do struggle to find stuff, and some arranged marriages work really well. And I'm not going to dispute them. The main word you said there was forced. As long as people are not forced into something and you do follow the Islamic law where you ask the permission of the children, then I don't see why you can't arrange something. And if they're both happy, that's fine. If they're not happy, then you're happy to accept that they're not happy and you walk away. I just think it is a bit, it's tested time and it's been happening for years. I just don't think it needs to be forced. And I do think sometimes it helps people as well to arrange and find people.
Is there a difference between introduction and arranged?
What would your definition of arranged be?
I'm not sure because I don't have it in my culture. So
I think
we might have introductions where we'll say, "Oh, this auntie's got a son similar age to your daughter. You know, do you want to speak?" We might have an introduction that way. But
I guess that's what I mean by arranged in certain ways. So when I'm thinking about it, it's more about, let's get two people in a room which may be compatible, let them talk to each other, and if they do get on, then they may want to take it and talk somewhere else and just see if they get on with each other, but in a more of a neutral settings rather than them going to find their own, dating for a little while and all of that side of things. This is more...
But is arranged marriage a little bit more structured in that then the families will meet and then they decide whether the families are compatible as well, and it's probably a bit more in depth than that?
I guess it is, because ultimately it's the husband, man and woman who will decide whether they want to be married. But unfortunately, realistically, it is the wider family that you have to think about as well, because you're not just married, that you are marrying into a family.
Indeed.
And we all know that however much people say, no, it's just the man and woman.
You're marrying into the family.
Exactly. And you have to be able to, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you have to just marry your own because you know that culture, you have to be able to be open to everyone. And as long as they've got the deen, then that's the most important thing, and the people are compatible and they can get on with each other. So I guess it depends on people's interpretation on arranged marriage, like you said.
Okay. And then what do we think to sort of young people using the nikah as a way of getting around dating? So, we all know there's a period of time of getting to know your spouse and knowing whether you are compatible and whether you can actually live with them. But there's also a phenomenon where young people are saying, well, we'll use nikah to make it halal.
Yeah.
And then, and is it the same commitment as saying I'm using nikah because I'm getting married?
It's interesting, just putting that aside for a second, when someone does a nikah and then they do, I know in our culture you do the nikah, and sometimes it's like an engagement, and then they have it for such a long period, and then they say, right, now we're going to get married, like a year or two later. It's like, I've got to know. But within that period, there are a lot that break down as well. And I was just like, well, the nikah technically, Islamically, is marriage. You are married. Just because you haven't left your parents' home doesn't mean you're not married to that person. But like you said, are they using it as a testing period? Should it be as long as they do before they leave home and settle in? Because it's different when you live with a person. It's usually different.
It is.
You learn a lot more about a person.
Indeed. And also, I think if you're not leaving your parents' home, then you're not ever going to really learn who that person is. Yeah.
That's it.
So that becomes a barrier in itself to a successful marriage.
Yeah. So going back to your thing about nikah, it's interesting because do they use it as a testing? It depends. I guess only they know their intentions. If it means that their parents are being pushy and forcing them into a marriage, then yeah, some children just think, well, yeah, just get the nikah done. Are they taking it seriously enough? That's the important question. Because a nikah is a contract.
Exactly. You're a young person, Kareema. What do you think?
Yeah, we've been married a bit longer.
Well, I think my opinion is a bit controversial, but I do believe that young people are using the nikah as a period of getting to know the person before actually having the marriage, which I think is important anyways in a relationship, just to know what you're getting yourself into and know what that person's like before you actually commit to having an actual marriage. But going on the question on arranged marriage, do you think there's a social pressure to get married? So if I say to my mom I don't want to get married and she's constantly trying to pair me up with someone, do you think there's just the pressure to, you know what, let's just get this done? Because
I guess it depends on what's people's views on marriage. Why do you get married, should I say? Because if it's just to, I don't know, some people might just want to get out of the house, some people want to find a spouse, some people want to move forward with life. Some people say the Islamic thing where it fulfills 50% of your deen. It really depends on the reasoning for the marriage. Is your mom just saying that you'd like to get married because she wants to think culturally, well, she's at an age, she needs to get married, what are people going to think? Then that probably isn't the right reason.
Yeah, because I think the question is, what's the importance of marriage? You know, if someone doesn't want to get married, like sometimes it's difficult to voice that out because people look at you some sort of way if you say, oh, I don't want to get married. Because
what would be the reason for not getting married? I guess if I turn it on its head.
Don't want to.
Do you not find it appealing?
Some people just feel like they're married to their careers and that's just what they want and they feel fulfilled and they don't necessarily want to have a lifelong commitment with someone. And that's okay, I think. But in terms of
I think a lot of young people think like that. I'm not saying it's a lot of people think like that. At the end of the day, they don't want to end up just being settled down young, having kids, and then that's kind of, they feel like it's the end of their life and that's it. They're ambitious, they want to get out there. But because I remember when I was doing that, this was obviously many years ago when we got married, it was one of those things where we were ambitious and we wanted to grow. And I got educated. My parents made sure all of that was done. And then I got married. But in a marriage, it also, for me, it was finding a lifelong partner and actually settling down with someone to say, right, we're going to try and work together, but also not for him to dismiss my ambitions. For him to say to me, okay, what would you like to do? Like I said, I've set up my own business because my husband supported me in doing that. Alhamdulillah, I had my children, was able to go on pilgrimage, did everything I needed to and be able to start my business to move it forward. But if you have that support with each other, you have a partner with you, a friend, to say, yeah, let me support you, let me move forward. And that is what I find in marriage. But until a young person doesn't see that there is a potential, they feel like if I get married, it's a barrier because I can't.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people think that most people in the older generation tend to put their dreams on hold when they do get married. Like that's the sort of idea. So no one wants to be limited to how much you can achieve or how much you can grow in your career. So I think that's really it's just raising more awareness on marriage and just making people aware that you can grow if you have someone that's supportive of your ambitions. Exactly. And I think that's important as well.
I suppose the way you conduct your marriage as well is down to you. And some people, are, like particularly women, are happy to say, yes, I've been educated, but I'm not going to pursue my career because I'm happy to be at home, be a supportive wife and mother. Whereas others might try to find that balance between pursuing career and having a family, and however that works within their marriage as well. So,
though it sounds ideal, and people would think, well, it's not possible to have everything. But what you have to realize is, when you get married, it isn't the end.
no, and it's not always everything. There are compromises always, but
Exactly.
it doesn't matter what marriage you have. There's always going to be compromises within that marriage. But it's about finding that harmony between the two of you and for the family as well.
Exactly. And in Islam, there were great women out there who had businesses, who had careers. It didn't mean that that was the end of it. And to move forward, it's just important to be able to find a spouse who you support each other, you support theirs. Because though we say men should go out there and work, they have dreams, they have ambitions. They don't just want to go out and work all day and Groundhog Day. They want to do stuff. So you should support them just as much as they support you.
And I think it's probably the hubris of youth as well, because they might see their moms, choosing a different life for themselves because they've entered the marriage, and they see as their moms have put their lives on hold. But it might not actually be that for their moms. They might, because as human beings, we need to feel fulfilled and find things that fulfill us. And for some women, it is raising children, it's fulfilling. It is supporting our husbands, it's fulfilling. Whereas for others, it might be that plus a career, or it just might be absolutely career-minded. So it's just about finding that thing that is fulfilling for us. And I think young people sometimes have different perceptions of what reality actually is. And probably because they're still young and they're quite individualistic, they don't actually see things for the reality that it is.
But what's scary is that they're still young, like you just said. And if they get to a certain age where they think, oh, damn it, I should have actually pursued that, you don't want them to regret it either. Because Islam brings the marriage is not a burden. It shouldn't be a burden to anyone. It's a blessing at the end of the day, that you should be able to find someone to grow a family, to grow with, and to grow each other, both not just in your careers, but also with your deen, with each other. It's supposed to be a growing process. And we get caught up in the rat race of life where we just want to move forward so much. I think it's just important to see it, that it's actually an Islamic side of things as well.
Yeah. And then our last question, should our in-laws be involved in our marriages? Because as I said, we do marry the family.
Do you know what? It depends how much. I just think in-laws are there to support you. If you come into a marriage already with that preset, this is what they're like, this is what society says, then inevitably it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where that is what's going to happen. If you come with a positive onset, it may not be a positive experience, but if you come in positively, then God gives you what you think. If you make it a positive experience, it is. Whether they need to be involved, I guess it's a cultural thing, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen, again, with the work that I do, I've seen the involvement of in-laws have actually probably done damage to a marriage, which if the parties were just talking to one another, they might have been able to save. And also that involvement has ongoing effects. So if the marriage is breaking down, we do see issues with them getting involved in the legal process of that marriage breaking down as well, which actually causes a lot more contention and raises other issues that weren't important and shouldn't really be part of that legal process.
Do they have any legal weighting?
Not at all.
Or not only in-laws, I'm talking about grandparents and everything else. No. It's interesting.
But they do get involved and cause issues.
Okay.
Well, I think it's hard for them to not get involved if you're living with your in-laws. Well, that's a separate conversation.
And obviously in-laws are always going to protect their children, aren't they? And that's what they do, no matter how old the child is.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
Well, you've been listening to the Legal Hour with myself, Gina Samuel Richards, Director Solicitor at AGR Law, Kareema Bakare, Paralegal, and Kausa Patel.